The morning sun filtered through the tall glass windows of the downtown bank, making the marble floors gleam. People came and went, some rushing with documents in hand, others chatting idly as they waited in line. It was a scene that looked ordinary to everyone there, but something extraordinary was about to unfold. The double doors opened slowly, and a woman stepped inside. She was dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, the kind of attire that spoke of quiet authority. Her walk was steady, graceful yet filled with a confidence that made people glance at her without even realizing why. She carried herself like someone who had faced the world's challenges and conquered them, but she didn't flaunt it. There was no need. She was the CEO of a major company, a leader who had built empires and created opportunities for thousands. But today she was not here as a powerful executive. Today, she was just a customer entering a bank to complete a simple verification tied to a massive partnership deal. A deal worth $2 billion. Money that could shift markets, change futures, and alter the very course of the bank's success. Yet no one in the room knew. To them, she was just another woman holding an ID card in her hand. She walked with quiet determination, her heels tapping softly against the polished floor. A few heads turned, admiring her elegance, but most people returned to their own tasks. After all, who would guess that the woman standing among them carried the weight of a deal bigger than most would see in their lifetime? In her hand, she clutched her identification. It was more than just a piece of plastic. To her, it represented years of struggle and resilience. She remembered the long nights of study, the doors that had been slammed in her face, the times when her worth had been questioned because of her race, her gender, or her background. That ID was proof of survival, proof that she had earned her place in the world through brilliance and hard work. As she approached the counter, she reminded herself of the importance of this day. This bank was not just another institution. They were close to sealing a deal, one that would bind their names together in financial history. She had chosen them carefully, believing they had the stability, the vision, and the value she wanted in a partner. All that was left was a simple step: identity verification. To her, it was routine. To the bank, it should have been a chance to show respect to someone who could transform their future. She adjusted her scarf gently, took a breath, and joined the short line at the teller's desk. Around her, customers chatted, children tugged at their parents, and the faint sound of typing filled the air. She stood calmly, patient and dignified. There was no sign of the storm that would soon follow. In those quiet moments of waiting, she thought of the people who relied on her employees, her shareholders, her community. This deal was not just about numbers on a page. It was about opportunity. $2 billion meant expansion, new jobs, and growth for everyone involved. She smiled faintly at the thought. She had come so far. When the line moved forward and it was finally her turn, she stepped toward the counter. She placed her ID gently on the desk, sliding it across with the same grace she carried in everything she did. To her, it was a simple act. To the teller who looked up at her, it was the beginning of something far different. The CEO waited quietly, her posture calm, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She expected professionalism. She expected efficiency. She expected the same courtesy anyone deserved when walking into a bank. But she had no idea that in just a few seconds, this ordinary moment of arrival would turn into an act of disrespect so sharp that it would change everything. The deal, the bank's future, and her faith in the institution she had once trusted. For now, though she stood tall, unaware, her arrival was just the beginning of a story that would soon echo far beyond the walls of that bank. The CEO stood patiently at the counter, her ID resting neatly on the desk between her and the teller. She gave a polite smile, the kind you offer when you expect a routine interaction. For her, this was supposed to be nothing more than a simple formality, a few minutes of checking details before moving on to much bigger matters. But from the very beginning, the teller's eyes told a different story. He looked up slowly, his expression flat, almost dismissive. His gaze flicked from her face down to her ID as though he couldn't be bothered to care who she was. Around them, the bank buzzed with its usual noise. Phones ringing, printers humming, customers whispering, but the space between them grew oddly tense. The teller picked up her ID with 2 fingers, not carefully, not respectfully, but as if it were something unimportant. He didn't even glance at her again before turning to his computer. His movements were casual, lazy even, as if her presence at his counter was an inconvenience. The CEO noticed the lack of acknowledgement, but stayed silent. She had learned long ago that silence was sometimes more powerful than words. Still, a small ache began to form in her chest. She had walked into this bank believing she was dealing with professionals. Instead, she was being treated as though she was invisible. The teller sighed loudly, typing in her details with exaggerated slowness. He leaned back in his chair, shook his head slightly, and muttered something under his breath that she couldn't quite catch. The customers behind her shuffled impatiently, but no one spoke. They too could feel the strange coldness in his tone. Finally, he looked up again, his eyes meeting hers with the faintest trace of irritation. "This ID," he said, pausing as if searching for the right words. "You sure it's valid?" His question wasn't professional. It was sharp, suspicious, carrying a weight that went far beyond a simple check. The CEO blinked, keeping her expression calm. "Yes," she replied softly. "It's valid." Her voice was steady, dignified, but inside she felt a sting. She had presented her identification countless times before. Never had anyone asked her that in such a tone. The teller smirked faintly as if unconvinced. He turned the card over in his hand, holding it up to the light, tilting it back and forth as though he were hunting for flaws. He even chuckled under his breath, a sound that made the moment feel heavier, more personal. Customers nearby began to glance over, sensing something was wrong. The woman waiting behind the CEO frowned, whispering to her husband, "Why is he acting like that?" She gave him her ID. The husband shrugged, uncomfortable but unwilling to step in. The CEO stood silently, her posture tall, her eyes steady. She refused to let his attitude shake her dignity. But inside she felt the weight of the years. Every time she had been questioned unfairly, every moment she had been underestimated or disrespected. This was not new, but it was never easier. The teller sighed again, tossing the ID onto the desk carelessly as though the verification didn't matter at all. The card slid across the surface and almost fell. The CEO caught it gently before it could drop, her fingers steady. She placed it back in front of him without a word. For a brief second, their eyes met again. His were filled with impatience, a kind of silent message. "You don't belong here." Hers were calm, but behind the calmness burned a quiet fire. She didn't need to shout to show strength. Her silence was already louder than his arrogance. He picked up the card again, tapping it against the desk, his jaw tight. "You people," he muttered softly, not realizing or not caring that she could hear. The words were faint but sharp enough to cut. The CEO's lips parted slightly, but she didn't respond. She had learned long ago that sometimes silence can be the sharpest weapon. Still, she knew in that moment that something had shifted. What should have been a routine process had turned into an act of disrespect. The teller leaned back once more, typing lazily into his computer, before glancing up with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Wait here. I'll get back to you." His tone was flat, almost commanding, as if he were addressing someone unworthy of courtesy. The CEO nodded politely, her expression unchanged, but her heart was heavy. This wasn't about a simple ID anymore. This was about dignity. This was about how one human being chose to treat another. What the teller didn't realize was that his careless attitude, his cold tone, and his lack of respect would soon carry consequences far bigger than he could ever imagine. For now, though, the CEO stood silently at the counter, her ID resting on the desk once again. She knew what she had felt in that moment, the sting of being treated as less even when she was more. But she also knew that her silence was not weakness. It was the beginning of something the teller, the bank, and everyone watching would never forget. The bank was busy, yet strangely quiet around the counter where she stood. The clicking of keyboards, the shuffle of papers, the faint hum of the air conditioning, none of it mattered. All eyes seemed to be drawn little by little to the space between the CEO and the teller. Her ID sat on the desk again, untouched. She waited with patience, her posture straight, her expression calm. She had faced worse storms than this in her life. Boardrooms full of men who doubted her. Negotiations where billions hung in the balance. Investors who questioned her abilities. She had fought through all of that with intelligence and grace. And yet, this moment, this small, ordinary transaction felt heavier than it should have. The teller picked up her ID again, his fingers tapping against it impatiently. He looked at it like it was nothing more than a burden. Then with a sudden flick of his wrist, he tossed it aside. The plastic card slid across the desk, flipped once, and fell to the floor with a sharp, humiliating slap. The sound was small, but it pierced the room like thunder. Conversations halted. Heads turned. The CEO froze, staring down at her ID on the floor. For a split second, the world seemed to stop. The teller didn't bend to pick it up. He didn't even look apologetic. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, as if the act meant nothing at all. His expression carried the kind of cold indifference that cut deeper than any insult. The customers nearby gasped softly. A woman in line whispered to her husband, "Did he just throw her ID?" The husband's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Another man shook his head slowly, muttering under his breath, "That's not right. That's not how you treat people." The CEO bent down slowly, her movement steady, controlled. Her fingers closed around the card, and she lifted it gently from the floor. She didn't rush. She didn't lash out. She simply stood tall again, brushing the edges of the card with her thumb as though wiping away the dust of humiliation. Her silence was powerful. She looked at the teller with calm eyes, not angry, not pleading, but steady, like a mountain that refuses to bow to the storm. The teller, however, avoided her gaze. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but still refused to say a word. For the CEO, the moment was sharper than words could ever be. This wasn't about an ID card. This wasn't about policy or procedure. It was about respect. It was about being seen. In that single careless act, the teller had revealed not only his disregard for her, but also the arrogance that often hides behind uniforms and counters. The room buzzed again, whispers spreading like fire. Someone near the back pulled out a phone, quietly recording. The incident, small as it seemed, carried a weight that everyone in that space could feel. This wasn't just a mistake, it was disrespect laid bare in front of witnesses. The CEO held the ID firmly now, her fingers steady. She could have spoken. She could have demanded an apology, raised her voice, or called for a manager. But she didn't. Instead, she stood in silence, letting the weight of the act settle around the room. Her silence was not weakness. It was power. It was the kind of silence that makes others uncomfortable, the kind that lingers long after words are forgotten. The teller tapped his keyboard again, trying to act as though nothing had happened. But the customers didn't forget. They kept glancing at him, at her, at the card in her hand. The air had shifted. What was once a routine banking visit had turned into a scene no one would forget. The CEO slid her ID back into her purse, her face unreadable. She didn't argue, didn't demand. She simply prepared to walk away with her dignity intact. But deep inside, a decision was forming. Quiet, deliberate, and far heavier than the teller could ever imagine. Because what he had tossed to the floor wasn't just a piece of plastic. It was trust. And once broken, trust cannot be picked back up and restored like an ID card. For now, though, she remained still, her silence speaking louder than his arrogance. The act of disrespect had been done, and though it seemed small in the teller's eyes, it was about to cost far more than he or the entire bank could ever afford. The ID lay on the floor for only a moment, but in that moment time itself seemed to pause. Conversation stopped. The air felt heavy, almost pressing down on everyone in the room. The bank teller leaned back casually, as though nothing had happened, as though tossing someone's identity onto the floor was just another part of his routine. The black woman CEO did not move right away. She looked down at the card resting near her heels, then back at the teller, her face still, her eyes unreadable. Inside, her heart throbbed with the sting of disrespect, but her posture never betrayed it. She had endured far too much in her life to let one careless man break her composure. Slowly, she bent down. Her hand, elegant and steady, reached for the ID. She picked it up with deliberate care, brushing away the faint dust from its surface with her thumb. The act was small, almost ordinary, but to those watching it carried the weight of something far larger. It was not the motion of someone defeated. It was the motion of someone choosing grace in the face of insult. She rose to her full height again, tall and commanding, though her voice remained silent. No anger left her lips, no sharp retort cut through the air. She simply slipped the card back into her purse with the same elegance with which she had entered the bank. The silence she carried was more striking than any outburst could have been. The customers who had witnessed the act exchanged uneasy looks. A woman holding her toddler shook her head slowly, whispering to the man beside her. She didn't even say a word. The man replied in a hushed tone, "She doesn't need to." "Look at her." Others murmured quietly, their voices rippling through the line like waves. The room knew something profound had just happened. The teller cleared his throat, trying to mask his discomfort. He shifted in his seat, his arrogance dimming slightly under the weight of so many eyes. Still, he didn't apologize. Instead, he pretended to return to his screen, typing with exaggerated nonchalance. But his movements weren't as smooth as before. Somewhere inside him, her silence had struck a nerve. The CEO stood there, still waiting, her calm presence impossible to ignore. The longer she said nothing, the more powerful her silence became. It was not the silence of weakness. It was the silence of a woman who had nothing to prove to him, or to anyone in that room. Her mind, however, was not still. Thoughts swirled quietly beneath the surface. She remembered other moments in her journey, moments when she had been underestimated, dismissed, or treated as though she didn't belong. Each time she had risen higher, worked harder, and proved herself beyond doubt. Tonight would be no different. But this time she would not fight with words. She would fight with decisions, the kind of decisions that ripple far beyond one moment, one man or one careless act. A young man in line, emboldened by her quiet strength, whispered just loud enough for others to hear, "That's not how you treat anyone. Especially not her." His words carried, and a few heads nodded in agreement. The teller's jaw tightened, but still he said nothing. The CEO's eyes finally lifted, meeting the teller's for just a second. It wasn't a glare. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper, an unspoken message that told him exactly what he needed to know. "You think you've humiliated me, but you've only revealed yourself." Then she looked away, her face calm again. She didn't need to explain herself. She didn't need to remind him who she was, what she carried, or the billions of dollars her decision could change. Her silence was enough. Around her, the weight of the moment lingered. People whispered, some outraged, some shocked, some simply quiet, trying to process what they had seen. The teller shifted again, tapping nervously at his keyboard. His authority, once sharp and dismissive, now felt small under the pressure of her unbroken calm. The CEO exhaled slowly, her hands resting at her sides. She would finish this transaction, perhaps, or perhaps she would simply walk away. Either way, she had already made her choice. She would not raise her voice in anger. She would not plead for respect. She would not remind him of her title. Her silence had already spoken louder than all of that. And though no one in that bank could know it yet, her calm response in this moment would echo far beyond the walls of that branch. It would reach boardrooms, headlines, and the very core of the bank's future. For now, however, the scene remained still. The woman stood dignified, her silence wrapping the room in an invisible force. The teller sat stiffly, trying to hide the shame crawling up his neck. And the audience of strangers, ordinary people waiting in line, realized they were witnessing something that would not be forgotten. The bank no longer felt like a place of routine. The act had been small, the toss of an ID card, but its weight filled the room. People who had come to pay bills, cash checks, or deposit money now stood caught between their own tasks and the scene that had just unfolded. What they had witnessed would not let them return to normal. The black woman CEO stood still, her ID safely back in her hand, her silence steady and unbroken. She had not shouted, had not demanded justice on the spot, but the quiet way she had picked up her ID and faced the teller spoke louder than anger ever could. That silence spread through the bank like a current, pulling people into its force. A woman near the front of the line leaned closer to her husband. "Did you see that?" she whispered sharply. "He threw her card on the ground like it was trash." Her husband nodded, his jaw tight. "That wasn't just rude," he muttered. "That was disrespect." Behind them, a younger man had already pulled out his phone. His fingers flew across the screen as he recorded his own short video, whispering to the camera, "This bank teller just disrespected a customer. You won't believe what I just saw." His hands shook slightly, not from fear but from the urgency of wanting others to know. The whispers grew louder. Some people were outraged, others cautious. "She didn't even raise her voice," one woman said softly. "But you could feel how wrong it was." Another replied, "She looks so calm, but I can tell she's not just anyone." The teller, suddenly aware of the eyes on him, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He tapped at the keyboard harder than necessary, trying to drown out the murmurs. But the harder he tried to appear indifferent, the clearer his discomfort became. The audience was no longer on his side. One man, an older gentleman in a brown jacket, cleared his throat loudly. "That's not how you treat a customer," he said firmly, his voice breaking through the whispers. The teller froze for a moment, his face turning slightly red, but he still refused to apologize. His pride held him silent, though the shame was already painted across his expression. The CEO remained still. Her silence didn't waver. She didn't need to speak for others to feel the weight of the moment. Slowly, her quiet strength began to shift the energy in the room. People who had once been only observers now felt like participants in something bigger. The young man with the phone whispered again, "I think she's important. Look at the way she carries herself. She's not just anyone." Others nodded. There was something undeniable about her presence, about the way she stood so firmly despite the insult. Outside the bank, life carried on as normal. But inside, the story was already spreading. 2 customers sent texts to family members describing what they had seen. One woman posted on social media, "Bank teller disrespects a black woman by tossing her ID to the floor." She stayed silent, but it was powerful. "People need to see this." Within minutes, her post began gathering comments. Back inside, the whispers turned into open conversation. "I hope she files a complaint," one man said. "This isn't just about bad service. This is about respect." Another added, "He probably thought she was nobody, but she's somebody." "You can feel it," the teller's face tightened. He could feel the shift. At first, he had believed the crowd was on his side, or at least indifferent. But now their energy pressed against him like a wall. Every whisper, every phone held up, every frown reminded him that the room was no longer safe for his arrogance. The CEO finally adjusted her purse strap and stood a little taller. She didn't speak, but her very movement seemed to give the crowd permission to react more boldly. A woman with a toddler shook her head and said loudly, "If this is how they treat their customers, I'm closing my account today." A ripple of agreement followed her words. The teller clenched his jaw, still silent, still refusing to meet the CEO's calm gaze. But deep inside, he knew something had slipped beyond his control. The moment was no longer his to dismiss. The witnesses had spoken, and their voices would not be contained. Some carried their outrage home, others online, but all of them carried the memory of what they had seen. The disrespect had not only been to her ID, it had been to her humanity. And though she had answered with silence, the people around her were answering with words, with videos, with action. What none of them realized yet was how far those voices would travel. By nightfall, the whispers inside the bank would transform into headlines. The video clips would spread faster than anyone could stop, and the story of that single careless act would rise far beyond the teller's desk, shaking the very foundations of the bank itself. For now, the witnesses whispered, spoke, and recorded. But their words were already seeds, and those seeds would soon grow into a storm no one could silence. The CEO left the bank with her ID tucked safely back into her purse. She did not storm out. She did not slam the doors. Instead, she walked slowly, her heels clicking against the polished floor, every step measured and calm. To the witnesses inside, her silence was unforgettable. To the teller behind the counter, it was haunting. And to herself, it was the beginning of a decision that would change everything. As she stepped into the sunlight outside, the weight of the moment pressed deeper into her chest. The insult had been small in action but massive in meaning. She had been disrespected not as a customer, not even as a CEO, but as a person. And she knew, when respect is lost, everything else falls apart. Her driver opened the car door and she slid into the back seat, resting her purse on her lap. For a long moment, she said nothing. The city outside bustled as usual, cars honking, people hurrying, neon signs flickering. But inside the car, there was silence. She took out the ID card and turned it slowly in her hand. To anyone else, it was just a card. But for her, it represented her journey. Years of building herself from the ground up, fighting through barriers of prejudice and doubt, earning every ounce of success she had. To see it tossed to the floor like trash was not just an insult. It was a betrayal of the values she had believed this bank shared. Her mind went back to the negotiations. For months, she had been in discussions with the bank's top leaders about a partnership that would move billions, strengthen markets, and create opportunities for thousands. She had been cautious, careful, but ultimately convinced that they were the right partners. She had trusted their promise of equality, a vision of shared respect. But now she saw the truth with painful clarity. A system that allowed such arrogance at its counters could not be trusted in its boardrooms. If one teller could treat her ID with such contempt, what kind of culture had been built inside the walls of that institution? Her phone buzzed beside her. A message from her assistant lit up the screen. Meeting with the bank's board confirmed for tomorrow. Final signing of the 2B partnership. She stared at the words for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the screen. Then slowly she locked the phone and placed it back in her purse. Her decision was already made. She would not confront the teller directly. She would not call the manager to complain. She would not waste her energy fighting a single man's arrogance. Instead, she would speak in the language that truly mattered to people who thought like him. Silence and withdrawal. Billions of dollars had been on the table. Years of projected profits, media headlines, global influence, all of it was within reach for the bank. But now, with a single quiet choice, she would take it away. Not out of anger, but out of principle. Her lips curved into the faintest, almost invisible smile. The teller thought he had thrown down her identity. What he didn't know was that he had just thrown down the bank's future. She leaned back in the seat, her eyes on the skyline outside the window. The decision gave her a strange sense of peace. It was not revenge, it was justice. It was dignity, and it was hers to give or withhold. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Ma'am, are we heading to the office?" he asked gently. "Yes," she said softly. Her voice was calm, even steady, but in her heart she knew. By the time the sun set, the deal would be gone. That evening in her office, she sat at her desk with the city lights glowing through the tall windows. She drafted a short message to the bank's executives. It was polite, professional, but final. "After careful consideration, I will not be moving forward with the partnership. I wish you well in your future endeavors." She read the words once more before hitting send. They carried no explanation, no anger, no accusations, just silence dressed as formality. But behind those few words was the weight of the insult she had endured. When she pressed send, she felt the finality of her choice. The bank would never fully understand the cost of that teller's arrogance until it was too late. And she would never forget the moment her ID had touched the floor. Not as a memory of pain, but as the spark of a decision that protected her dignity and her legacy. In the quiet of her office, she set her ID on the desk, smoothing its edges with her fingertips. It was no longer just a card. It was a reminder. Respect is not optional. Without it, no deal, no matter how big, could stand. Her silence at the counter had been her shield. Her decision now was her sword. The email was short, polite, and final. Just a few lines from her office late that evening, but the weight of it hit the bank like a storm. By the next morning, the boardroom buzzed with confusion. Executives sat around the long, polished table, their faces pale as they reread her message again and again. "After careful consideration, I will not be moving forward with the partnership. I wish you well in your future endeavors." At first, disbelief filled the room. The deal had been months in the making, billions at stake, and the finish line was only a day away. They tried to reassure themselves. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe she had sent the wrong email. Maybe she only wanted to renegotiate terms. But deep down they all knew. Her words were clear. The 2B deal was gone. The executives scrambled, phones ringing, emails firing back and forth, urgent calls placed to her office. But every attempt met the same wall, silence. She didn't reply, didn't explain. Her silence was her answer. News traveled fast. By midday, whispers had already spread beyond the walls of the boardroom. Reporters caught wind of the collapse. Analysts speculated on live television, and competitors smirked as they realized one of the largest banks in the country had lost a once-in-a-generation partnership. The stock price trembled, dipping lower with each new headline. Inside the bank branch where it had all begun, employees whispered about the incident. The story had leaked. Someone had recorded the moment the teller tossed her ID. The video spread like wildfire online. People replayed it again and again. The flick of the teller's hand, the ID card falling to the floor, the CEO's quiet dignity as she picked it up. The video didn't need commentary. It spoke for itself. Unbelievable, one customer tweeted. This bank lost a $2 deal because of disrespect. Powerful silence, another wrote. She didn't yell. She just walked away, and that's how you win. The teller became the unwilling face of the scandal. His photo circulated on news blogs, his name whispered in anger across social media. Customers poured into the branch demanding answers. Some closed their accounts on the spot. Others stood in line only to lecture the managers about respect, about arrogance, about how one small act could destroy trust. The CEO of the bank called an emergency press conference. Cameras flashed as he stood stiffly behind a podium, reading from a prepared statement. He apologized for an unfortunate incident, promising an internal review and retraining programs. But the apology rang hollow. The public had seen the video. They knew what had happened, and they also knew what had been lost, $2 billion. A partnership that would have expanded the bank's reach globally. Years of projected growth wiped out overnight. Shareholders raged. Customers doubted. Employees felt ashamed. All because of one man's arrogance and a woman's dignified silence. Meanwhile, the black woman CEO went about her business quietly. She didn't appear on television, didn't grant interviews, didn't explain herself. She simply moved forward, redirecting her company's resources toward other opportunities. Her silence only fueled the story further. People debated her choice, admired her strength, and repeated her words. After careful consideration, I will not be moving forward. Those words became a symbol, quoted in articles, shared in posts, painted on graphics across social feeds. For the bank, the fallout deepened. Regulators asked questions. Investors threatened lawsuits. Competitors reached out to the woman with offers, praising her dignity while quietly thanking their luck. Employees whispered in hallways, "Can you believe we lost everything because of that teller?" Others defended her, saying, "No, because of how the bank allowed such behavior." The teller himself disappeared from the branch. Rumors swirled. Was he fired? Suspended? Protected? No one knew for sure. But it didn't matter anymore. His single careless act had already carved itself into the bank's history as the mistake that cost billions. By week's end, the video had been viewed millions of times. Headlines screamed the same message: respect matters more than money. Editorials praised the CEO's choice, calling her silence a masterclass in dignity. Parents shared the story with children as a lesson. Universities discussed it in lectures. The world had turned a single moment into a global conversation, and the bank? It carried the weight of its failure. Its logo, once a symbol of stability, now carried the shadow of disrespect. Its leaders tried to move on, but the partnership's collapse became a scar they could not hide. All of it. Every loss, every headline, every whisper, came from that quiet decision she made the moment her ID touched the floor. Weeks passed, but the story refused to fade. What had begun as a single careless gesture inside a bank had grown into something far larger. A lesson carried across headlines, classrooms, boardrooms, and living rooms around the world. People no longer spoke of it as just an incident. They spoke of it as a turning point. The black woman CEO never once gave an interview about what had happened. She never sat under the glare of television lights or explained herself to reporters. She let the world piece together the meaning in their own way. Her silence, the same silence that had held steady in the bank that day, remained her strongest response. And strangely, it made the story even more powerful. Her company thrived. Other banks, competitors to the one that had lost her partnership, reached out immediately. They didn't just offer deals, they offered respect. They praised her vision, her leadership, her composure. Investors, too, admired the way she had handled herself. This, one headline read, is what true leadership looks like. Dignity over dollars. At the same time, the bank that lost her was still reeling. Customers continued to close accounts. Analysts called the 2B collapse a historic mistake. In conferences and seminars, the example was repeated again and again, how arrogance at the lowest level could cost an institution everything. The teller's face, once unknown, became infamous online, a reminder of how one careless act can ripple outward and destroy trust on a massive scale. But for the public, the focus was never really on him. It was on her. The image of her bending down gracefully to pick up her ID, then rising tall with silence and dignity, spread across social media like wildfire. Memes, quotes, and articles called her the woman who taught the world that silence can roar louder than anger. In schools, teachers used the story to show children the value of self-respect. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. But she still won. A teacher told her students, pointing to the article projected on the screen. This is strength. In offices, managers told employees to remember the story whenever they dealt with customers. Respect everyone, they warned. You never know who stands in front of you. For the CEO herself, the legacy wasn't about fame. She didn't care about the millions of views or the endless debates. What mattered to her was the principle that respect is non-negotiable. She had built her empire on that truth. She had seen firsthand how easily dignity can be dismissed, and she had vowed never to let it be dismissed in her presence again. Her employees admired her even more. To them, she was proof that power doesn't have to be loud. It can be quiet, calm, and graceful, and still move mountains. When they walked into her office and saw her ID resting neatly on her desk, they understood. That small piece of plastic had become a symbol not of humiliation, but of triumph. The bank, meanwhile, faced endless questions about culture, values, and training. How could this happen? Shareholders demanded, but the truth was simple. Respect had not been part of their foundation. And when respect is missing, everything built on top of it eventually collapses. In the years that followed, the story of that day lived on. It was told and retold not just as gossip, but as a parable. The legacy of her silence became larger than the incident itself. It reminded people everywhere that titles, money, and status mean nothing without dignity, and that dignity cannot be tossed aside without consequence. For the CEO, life moved forward. She continued to lead, to expand, to inspire. She didn't need to mention the bank ever again. Their name had become a cautionary tale. Her name had become a symbol of quiet strength. One evening, long after the noise had faded, she sat in her office looking out at the city lights. She held her ID card in her hand, the same one that had once been thrown to the floor. She smiled faintly. To anyone else, it was still just a card, but to her it was a reminder of the day she proved that silence, dignity, and principle could carry more power than billions of dollars. Her legacy was not the deal she ended. It was the truth she upheld. And long after the teller's arrogance was forgotten, the world would remember her, standing tall, saying nothing, yet teaching everything.